Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Tonight we have some Bigfoot stories for you. As the sun went down, I left the east gate of Yellowstone. Somewhere between there and Cody, maybe halfway, it got dark and I saw a dark two-legged thing move out of the light tunnel made by my van. It was very short and I got a field and stream and run around the school Comcast when I got back to Florida. I went to the BFRO after reading it and found the wound in the hotspot, and it all came back. I'm a careful observer, and I've learned that sometimes your eyes can trick you. Before I told my wife about the school Comcast article or the other information, I asked her if she remembered anything I said on the way home from Yellowstone. She said that the only thing she could remember me saying was that I was joking about seeing Bigfoot, because some time had passed. I wanted to make sure it wasn't a false memory. It had been a long day, and we had seen a lot of animals. As we were leaving the park, we saw a mother grizzly bear with two cubs. Color-wise, what I saw looked like a moose. I've always said that it's the black that moves at the edge of your lights that makes it hard to see moose at night. By watching how an animal moves, you can often tell what it looks like. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it's 2:30 in the morning now. So please excuse me, I'm a bit sleepy. I was going to go back this summer to look around more. Last summer, I was finishing up my master's degree at Colorado State. In between classes, I had a week off. So we went to Yellowstone to see if we could see a grizzly bear there, and I went to Washington. I would have probably been looking for the huge adjective cars a long time ago. When I was doing a project for an animal behavior class at the University of Florida, I talked to Dr. Krantz and Peter Byrne. When I called them, they seemed trustworthy and helped me a lot. From the middle of the eastbound lane to the middle of the westbound lane to the gravel on the side of the road, I remember it taking a second or two and 2 steps. Dark and large, half laughing. I told my wife that I had seen a Sasquatch. She said that she had seen one too. We laughed at each other and said, "We must be tired." She told me to turn around, making me laugh even more. Just that we're tired. She said that we didn't even know if we'd ever be able to come back. I never thought about it again after I went to the BFROO. But I'll go back this summer, most likely in June, depending on how much gas costs. Again, things are getting crazy. I like being outside and will be in the Cody, Wyoming area in the second week of July, around the 14th. I will be on the road to Yellowstone National Park, which is about 40 miles west of Cody. Late in the day, there were a lot of tourists around. I decided not to fight it when I wanted to get off the highway for a while and go for a walk. Instead, I hiked up an unmarked path through some trees north of the highway. I was going at a slow pace, looking for Native American artifacts and exploring rocky outcrops. Well, I could still hear cars about a half-mile from the road. I could hear rocks rolling downhill in front of me and above me. It was maybe 100 yards away, and there are a lot of mule deer and other game animals in the area, so I didn't think much of it. I brought bear spray with me because this was grizzly bear country. After maybe another half hour, I took a break and sat on a rock ledge where I could see the valley to the south. I heard the sound of an animal walking through the trees again on a steep wooded slope that led down to a dry stream bed. I could tell by the way the underbrush was breaking that it was an animal. I didn't give it much thought. I'm used to hearing things like game in the woods and don't scare it. I think the animals were deer eating along the slope. A bit strange, given the time of day. It didn't act like a bear, which don't hang out when people are around. I started hiking again, and almost as soon as I did, I heard something move through the brush just below me in the same spot. I thought this was a little strange, like it was following me around or something. I tried to look down the hill, but I couldn't hear it when I stopped. It stopped moving when I did, and I couldn't figure out where it was. I started to feel a little uneasy about how things were going. At this point, I don't know how to explain it other than to say that something seemed to be staying with me on purpose. I got back to walking. After not hearing anything for a while, I heard something running across the rocks right in front of me. It was up and no longer in the drain. At this point, I was starting to feel a little scared, so I started walking back toward the road, which was about a mile away. I walked pretty quickly, and until I was about a quarter mile from the highway, I didn't hear much. About 15 minutes after I went back the way I came, I heard rocks and other things falling down the slope again. It seemed to be very close, so I turned around because I thought I might see something, which I did. so I'll try to explain it as best I can. But since I only saw it briefly, I can't be sure what it was. About 60 or 70 yards away, it was on a rocky slope, right next to the same heavily wooded slope. I was hiking when I saw it. As soon as I turned around to look at it, it jumped into the cover and was gone. I know for sure that whatever it was standing up because I could see two parts of the ground that looked more like arms than legs. They were definitely hanging down the side, not down the front, as you might expect from a four-legged animal standing on two legs. This doesn't mean it wasn't a bear, but I've never heard of a bear acting like this, if I'm right, and it was the same animal that I think has been following me the whole time. People say that bears can be dangerous when they follow people, so who knows? In any case, the animal had very long brown hair. I saw that when it jumped into the woods, its hair kind of swayed to one side because of the sudden movement. The hair seemed longer than bear hair, and for me to notice this swinging effect from this far away, I would guess that the hair was at least a foot long. In that split second before it took off, I got a good look at its long, flat face. It was too far away for me to make out its individual features, but I've seen bears from farther away and never thought it was a bear. I didn't know about the Brawl 4 at the time the event described in it happened in this area. When I told this story to a friend who had never heard of the BFRO, neither of us knew what it was. We looked up Bigfoot because we were interested. I was a little surprised to see on the main page that there have been many sightings of Bigfoot in this area. I thought it would be best to say something. I think there were witnesses to all three of the other events, but not to mine. So I can't point to someone else who can confirm that I did see her. It would have been nice to find out if anyone else saw something similar to what I think I saw. Trust me when I say that it takes a little while for it to fully register in your mind. Hey, look, it's a Bigfoot. I was probably almost back at my car before that thought came to me. I'm not sure what I saw, but I'd been hearing it all the way through the woods the whole time I was hiking. People usually make these connections after the fact, but I have no way of knowing for sure. I think it might have been, though, but this is more of a gut feeling than anything else. I realized that breaking branches and rocks sliding down hills aren't exactly proof of science. It did feel like someone or something was watching me, that's for sure. Also, the thing that happened in the late afternoon. At the time, the weather was clear and it was easy to see, so there wasn't a real case of mistaken identity. There may have been some storms in the area, but it wasn't raining at the time. It was 1980s winter. After a 5-mile hike from the road up to a lake, my older brother and I went hiking and camping in Yellowstone Park. People said that was the only place in North America, besides the Arctic, where you could catch an Arctic grayling. After eating the day's catch and cleaning up, we set up camp for the night. We went to bed early because we were tired from hiking and fishing all day. We were talking quietly in our tent and starting to feel sleepy when all of a sudden something big and heavy ran by on two legs. We both had our eyes popping out of our heads as we looked at each other. I told him to just go check it out, he said. No way, and since we didn't have any weapons or sidearms, we just sat there scared for the rest of the night. At dawn, we broke camp and went out to look for tracks, but the ground was empty and there was no sign of the visitor from the night before other than what we had seen. I'm not going to say anything about the park where I work because I still do. But in the 4 months since all this COVID-19 craziness started, strange and scary things have happened. For example, the biggest one is that we have been finding random human remains hanging from trees all over the park. I know that sounds scary, but I promise you that it's just one of many scary things that have been going on. We might only find one of these human bones once a week or once every few weeks. Sometimes we find 3 or 4 a week, and they are never in the same place. It's always in different places, but it's always left hanging by a rope and a tree. The human remains in question were skulls that had not been damaged by weather or rot. They looked like they had been left there for nature to take. Because there are human remains involved, the police have never gone to investigate. From what I know, forensics have shown that every skull found so far is from a person who has been missing for at least a few years. It's a very bad thing. I'll agree with that. We don't know who is putting these skulls up in trees or why. So far, we have no leads and can't find any evidence of who is doing it. But if things keep going wrong, I'll let you know. I'll tell you what I know. But I do work in one of the biggest parks in the country, with a large staff, and I'm not the only one who finds these schools. As I said before, there's a lot of ground to cover because this park is so big, and there are many other people on our team who also find skeletal human remains like feet and sometimes hands while working in the Forest Service and doing search and rescue. Human remains aren't always hard to find, especially those of people who are missing and especially those who have been gone for a long time. But this is a whole new level of scary because it's very unlikely to find the missing parts of people whose bodies were found tied to ropes and only parts of them. It almost seems like something or someone is setting it up in a morbid way for us to find. I don't know if this is a group or just one person, but these schools are in places that regular people couldn't get to. For example, in a park, we found 3 schools in the last 2 months because there was so much brush. Most of the time, you need pretty thick clothing to get back in there. And if we didn't have our big tools and know that this area is there, you wouldn't even know how to find your way back. It's hard to say what happened. I don't think I'm making much sense, but what I'm trying to say is that anyone could sneak back there and put a human skull there. He wouldn't need a lot of gear to get back there, and we would all see him since we keep a close eye on the park. Anyway, I'll keep in touch with you and write you back. If we find something new or interesting to write about, we will. In the meantime, just know that scary things are still happening all over the country. Not just in our neighbourhoods with COVID, but also in our national parks, so stay safe. So, I no longer work for the Forest Service, but I did for a long time, and when I did, I had a lot of stories about it that I could tell you, but I won't for now. What I will tell you is that when I was working around the lower East Coast for a short time, I would see strange lights going off in the forest early in the morning. I worked at night, but I don't want to say I worked the night shift. I worked early in the morning, and from where I was in my station, I had a great view of a certain part of the park. Now, the park where I worked was a lot of miles long. I don't know the exact size, and I'm kind of afraid to tell you the name of the park because I'm afraid this will be linked back to me, and I don't want to be sued or harassed because of it. I may be overly worried, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Also, the lights I'm talking about weren't ordinary ones. If you're wondering, I'm talking about flashlights that move around. No, even though the lights I saw moved and pulsed. It was like a really bright flash on a camera, but it lasted longer and was sometimes brighter. The light also changed colours and pulsed, but there was no real pattern or timing to it. It didn't match any pattern of lights or anyone turning on and off their lights. It didn't make much sense. Sometimes you would turn on more than one light in different places, but I could see them all from where I was. At one point, there were 6 lights on at the same time, and they were all doing different things. One pulsed, another seemed to flash, and the rest would just go out at random times. This was really odd, and when this kept happening night after night after night, it really started to creep me out. So I finally told my boss about it, and I was really surprised by how he treated me. He kind of yelled at me about it and told me to shut up and keep quiet. He said it would be best for my career if I ignored it and went back to doing my job and doing what he said. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't care enough to poke and prod more to find out what. I never found out what those lights were. But then again, do I really want to? I'm not sure, now that my mind and knowledge have been opened to all the park ranger stories and tales out there, even though I'm sure some of them are just creepypasta and others are probably true. It's interesting to know that strange things happen all the time in national parks, and that what I saw was just a small part of what other park rangers have to deal with, which is scary in and of itself. I'm glad I got out of that line of work when I did. First of all, I didn't believe in Bigfoot before this whole thing. But now I know they are real, and I don't care if they are humans, creatures, or part ape. I don't care what a Bigfoot expert says about how peaceful they are. They scare me no matter what they are. I've had my own experience, and no one can change that. So, a few other rangers and I were able to close a trail for good because hikers and travellers were afraid of being hurt by a group of Bigfoot who were apparently travelling through the area and throwing rocks and logs at hikers who were on this part of the trail. At least 5 different people told us that they had seen these big, hairy people who looked like they were half man and half ape throwing rocks, screaming, knocking on wood and making a lot of noise during the month that this was going on. When we went to check out the area, we saw these things for ourselves. My co-worker and I, who didn't believe in ghosts before, now do because we saw what we thought was the big alpha male almost throw a whole dead log at us. We were pushed out of the trees by this thing, and rocks were thrown at us, and there was a lot of noise and screaming. In the forest, there were also noises like wood knocking, pounding, thudding, and all kinds of crazy thrashing around. And to be honest, just thinking about what happened and reliving it in my head is very scary because, like everyone else, I was told my whole life that monsters don't exist. Bigfoot don't think they don't exist, etc., etc. Well, I'm here to tell you that people will lie to you, and they already have. These things are very real, and we need to be careful not to make them even more angry. They are very possessive, and we don't know what would have happened if we had stayed longer or maybe made them angry. Since then, that part of the trail has been shut down for good. I don't know if it will be permanent or not, but it will be like this until my boss gets in touch with someone who can handle the problem. Only in the last few months did this happen, so it's still kind of new. It was right before everyone was put in quarantine, so it might have been early March. It was right when spring was beginning, so that was when we saw it. I've been doing this job for a while and have seen a lot of things, but this is a whole new level. If anyone wants to know, I haven't seen stairs in the woods or any of that nonsense. I don't think that's true. But I can't deny that what I went through has changed how I think about my whole life and my job. It's likely that I'll stay in this field for a long time, even though this happened to me because I still love working as a ranger and being a part of search and rescue. But I think sometimes I just have to learn to deal with it. There are things in the woods that I might not be able to handle mentally, and I'm not just talking about finding dead bodies or children who have gone missing. From this, I've learned that there are things out there that are much worse than any of those. Things from your nightmare that you normally wouldn't think are real. I just got back from Renfrew County, about 3 hours north of me, where there is a place called Mad Ayahuasca Valley. It is on the edge of Algonquin Park to the south. There have been several reports from that park, including one about a meeting I had there in 2008. 3 of my other friends and I had a different experience in the same park. It involved throwing rocks, smelling bad, and even finding feces. This week, my family and I rented a cottage on a small private lake called Spectacle Lake. The cottage is in the middle of a forest, and there are moose, deer, wolves, beavers, and even bears in the area. When we got there at 1:00 p.m. on Monday, July 27, we unpacked and settled in for the afternoon. At 6:00 p.m., after a nice meal, we sat around a big fire. Had about 20 hours of sleep at around age 22 while sitting around a fire and talking. I heard something far away across the lake. I told everyone to be quiet because I could hear something over the sound of our fire. Then I heard the howls coming from the other side of the lake. It takes about 500 m to get across the lake. In the background, there are cliffs behind a thick forest. The house seemed to go well beyond the distance across the lake and even past the cliffs behind the tree line. I think the cliffs are about 150 m high. On the other side of the lake, there are no cottages. A long way to the north of us are 3 small cottages. During the week, though, no one was at those cottages. I've heard these kinds of sounds before, so I thought it was a Sasquatch. However, no one else in my group had ever heard anything like it, so they were all surprised and very excited. Everyone agreed that the sounds coming from the house did not sound like wolves, coyotes, loons, deer, moose, or any other animal we know. Each house went on for about 30 minutes, and there were about 3-4 of them each time. Around midnight, the fire was going out, so we all went to sleep in the cottage. But right before we went in, we heard a big branch nearby break. I'd say it was about 20 feet from the cottage in the tree line, and it was a clear, distinct crack of a tree limb. I'd say that the tree branch is about 1 or more once more. I understood what it was. Since this has happened to me before, I tried to look into the tree line to see if I could see anything. I didn't hear or see anything else. I didn't want to shine a flashlight because I thought it might put an end to the night's activities. So I went inside the cottage. Soon after that, we all went to bed. When I checked the time at 3:30, something had already hit or broken something in the cottage very, very hard. The whole cottage shook and we all woke up. Keep in mind that this cottage is pretty big. It has 2 stories, a walkout basement, and enough beds for all 8 of us. I saw what was going on and got up to take a look. I didn't want to think that one of the kids or dogs could have walked by in the dark and knocked something off a shelf. So I walked around the whole house, from the top to the bottom. Everyone was in their beds, even the dogs. Even though I know the dogs heard and felt the bang, they didn't move from where they were. I looked outside, but it was so dark that I couldn't see anything, so I just went back to bed. I stayed awake and listened to see if anything else was going on. Then, about half an hour later, I could hear something outside the open window, mumbling or grumbling. This is the best way I can think of to explain it. It was close to my window, but I couldn't see anything when I looked out. I didn't want to shine a light in hopes of seeing more activity. At 4:15, something scraped along the outside of the cottage in a long, loud way. The next morning, there was nothing. At 6:30 I got up and looked around the outside of the cottage and the area around it. All around the cottage, the ground is hard, so I didn't find any prints. I went inside the tree line, but I couldn't find any clear signs. On the outside walls, I couldn't find any smudges or signs of damage. I couldn't find the break in the tree. I don't see any rocks or sticks that could have been thrown near the cottage. I also couldn't find any signs of the scratch. The next night, July 28, as we sat around our campfire, we heard the same screams and hail coming from across the lake. This happened now and then until about 5:00 AM. Wednesday and Thursday, nothing else happened, but I heard the screams and howls again in the middle of the night on Friday, July 31. Since there were 8 people who saw us sitting around the campfire or in the cottage, it seems unlikely that someone would be out here trying to trick us. All around the area, there are a lot of people and things that make it hard to get to. All of the land around the water is like the Canadian Shield. It is a very hilly area, and the Matanuska Valley has tall, visible rock cliffs and even some swamps. There is a lot of wildlife there, including bears, wolves, coyotes, deer, moose, beavers, other small game, and a lot of fish. First backpacking site on the Western Uplands, backpacking trail, Rain Lake, Algonquin Provincial Park, Ontario, Canada. I was about to fall asleep in my tent when the forest around me went completely quiet. It wasn't easy to feel that way. Then I heard something huge hit the ground. The thud wasn't loud at all, so it didn't wake up my sleeping son. I thought the third was my heart giving out because it was followed by arrhythmia, and I was praying that this wasn't the time or place for me to have a heart attack. Then I thought I smelled a skunk, but when I took a second, deeper breath, I couldn't smell anything. The forest stayed quiet, and I listened carefully because I thought a bear had come to see us. The next morning, my son and I did some tests because you can feel vibrations when you walk on the thin soil that covers the shield rock, which sounds like hollow ground. We knew that whatever it was had to have been within 4 feet of the tent because we walked on it. We can't make the thud sound the same way again. We did, however, figure out where the animal got off the trail and into the campsite. Neither of us had gone that way that night. We also think a 400 bear couldn't have made a thud if it hadn't jumped. I thought it looked more like a sown 1,000 moose, but I couldn't figure out why a moose would be so close to a campsite. Later that night, I thought I heard a loon hoot, but it sounded more like a whoop than a hoot, and it was much, much louder. There was an 8-foot-tall tree. There was a piece of wood about 1 foot in diameter that had broken off about 2 feet above the ground. When we got to the camp, the splinters were still on the ground and weren't covered by things like pine needles or the ground around them. The branch had been broken off the tree. I noticed this when I cut the splintered end off the stump for firewood in the morning. It hadn't been chopped down or cut down. It was nothing but a stump. At the time, I didn't think much of a dead tree that had been blown down in the woods, but looking back, it was new and there was no debris on the stump, which makes me wonder where the tree had been. Someone must have been burning it all day. When we got there, there wasn't enough fresh ash in the fire pit. Also, who cuts up a downed tree and hauls the whole thing away to use as firewood? I'm not even sure the tree was in that shape when I first looked at the area. After going on to serve the second site and coming back to the first, I didn't notice until my son and I had been away from the site for a while and the bear bags were still there. Earlier that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I finally asked my son what. I thought he was talking to me, but I didn't understand what he was saying. He told me he hadn't said anything. Listen, I've been to bear country and chased one off before, but that was when my son was 7, not 12 like he is now, and I took my 16-month-old daughter there last week. But I can honestly say that this was the most scared I've ever been, if it was a Sasquatch or whatever they're called. I think I know why they don't like us being there. At the bridge, I tried out a bear banger flare to make sure there was one that worked. The flare was carried by the wind and hit a tree. Stupid me. It was embarrassing to have to tell my son to wait on the trail while I checked to see if my stupid mistake hadn't set fire to the forest. I was so careless. Anyone who saw me do this would have thought I was a beginner and wouldn't want me camping near them, which is true because I am a beginner when it comes to backpacking. I've been wilderness canoe camping in places like this dozens of times, but this area was full of moose and bear tracks and many bear footprints that were bigger and longer than I'm used to seeing. Everything didn't make sense, so they got up and left. We gave up in the last week of our trip. I felt like I was being watched as I walked out, and I saw something big in the bushes about 40 m away. When they looked into it, they found nothing. I just thought she had a big imagination. But the more I think about it, the more things start to make sense. I was cutting firewood with my brother in a designated area about halfway between Cody and Yellowstone. We were south of the highway and close to the north bank of the North Fork, a river that flows into Buffalo Bill Reservoir from the east. This area doesn't have a lot of trees, so you can see the high north-facing mountain slopes to the south of the river. Just before the sun went down, I saw movement on the hillside across the river. At first, I thought it must be a bear or an elk and told my brother about it. My brother got the binoculars out of the truck because we are hunters and like to keep track of where we see elk. At first, he seemed surprised and like he didn't know what he was looking at instead of jumping. In the end, he gave me the glasses and told me to look at them. By the time I put on my glasses, the animal had moved into the trees and I could no longer see it. Shortly after that, I saw it again lower down on the slope in a small clearing. It was moving around the whole time. At this point, I thought it was about a quarter mile away, moving closer to the river as it went down the slope. This time, the glasses helped me see it well. It was definitely standing up and walking on 2 legs, but it was too far away to tell how tall it was. It looked to be between 6 and 10 feet tall. The thing that stood out the most, though, was its size. The animal with dark hair almost looked fat, but this wasn't a bear. I watched it walk for at least 100 yards, and it never got down on all fours. I know for sure that there is something on the North Fork, never seen before. We were loading the truck about 30 minutes after the last time I saw him. Since the chainsaw wasn't going, we could hear pretty well. Before we left, it was almost completely dark, and the river was making some noise. I heard a strange, high-pitched sound coming from about 100 yards upstream, but I never heard anything like that before. Around this time of year, you can still hear elk bugling. This was no elk, ladies and gentlemen. My friend and I, who are both geologists, were there when we saw it, while driving from Cody to Yellowstone to get a job there for the summer. When it was my friend's turn to drive, I tried to take in as much as I could and tell him what I was seeing to keep him awake on the long drive. As we turned a bend in the road, our high beams lit up a large, dark, shaggy figure coming out of the ditch on the left side of the road, south of the road, about 200 to 50 feet away, as we get close to the figure at about 45 m. It first looked at the car, and we could see the yellow light that shines from a dog's eyes when light hits them at night. Then it turned its head away from the lights on purpose. That movement didn't look like a human or a bear's, and the shoulders, chest and head all moved at the same time as it saw our car and turned its face away from the headlights. We sped up. Well, we actually slammed on the brakes. We were shocked by what we saw and trying to figure out what it was. It looked like some kind of hominid creature, maybe 7.5 feet tall. We have a friend who is 7 feet tall and weighs between 600 and 800 pounds, but he doesn't look like he's overweight. He climbed out of the ditch on the left side of the road, right at the edge of the metal barrier above the culvert, and stood up straight. It took 3 very long and smooth steps across the highway, which added up to 22 feet, and 3 or 4 shorter steps down the other side of the road, where it seemed to grab hold of the metal barrier and railing with one long-fingered, hairy hand. It then swung down under the road into the box culvert or channel bottom, which was out of our line of sight. We stopped the car about 25 feet from the culvert and watched the final descent of the creature. At this point, we headed toward Yellowstone National Park's East Gate, hoping to find a park ranger to tell about the sighting and maybe go back and take another look. Since it was late, nobody was at the gate, and we didn't see any lights on anywhere, we just kept going to our destination and went to sleep, deciding not to sleep, deciding not to talk about what we'd seen until the next morning. We both wrote and drew as much as we could about what we had seen 6 hours earlier. This is a summary of what we found. They were almost exactly the same, right down to which lake moved first. As the creature crossed the road, the head seemed to come out of the neck, and there was no snout or other part of the face sticking out like you would usually see in a bear. I know because I've seen hundreds of them up close and in person. The face was hard to make out, and it was only seen briefly. We both thought that some of it was hidden by long hair. Both of our noses were big and wide, but neither of us could describe the mouth or teeth. The eyes weren't anything special, they just reflected gold, like the dog's. But each of us can still clearly describe the creature's size, shape, and unique fluid movement. It was big, probably between 7 and 7.5 feet, but not much bigger. It looked and felt very heavy and powerful. It had a thick, short neck, broad shoulders, and a full chest. Its head was long and blocky, with a slight dome on the top. It had a square shape and a longer torso and hips than a person. And as it walked across the road in front of us, we could see that its buttocks were big, muscled masses that moved under thick, shaggy fur. They were clearly attached to long, strong, muscled thighs that were longer than a human big toe and worked like a human knee. The oversized body had thick, muscular calves and feet that fit with the rest of the body. The soles of the feet don't look like they have much hair or any hair at all, and they are a very dark color. The arms were longer than a human's and hung from shoulders with a lot of muscle. They reached to the knees and moved fully and almost horizontally in front of and behind the body. The elbows might have been a little further down the arm than on a human, or it might have looked that way because of how long arms usually are. The fingers were long and the hands were big. We couldn't say much about the creature's palms, nails, or anything else except for the backs of its hands, which were covered in the same long, shaggy, dark brown hair as the rest of it. The creature didn't move or make a sound. During the whole time we saw it, it seemed a little startled when our car came out of the dark, but it didn't seem scared or afraid in any other way. We were both surprised though, that's for sure. On April 20, a friend and I walked 2 miles west of Highway 89 in Wyoming to get supplies to a bear bait site. This area is only accessible on foot or horseback and is on the border between Idaho and Wyoming. I had brought in the bait barrel and some bait items a week before. I had seen bear tracks in the snow along the creek the first week of April. We walked along the foot trail early in the morning, and about a mile in came across the fresh body of a muskrat right on the trail, which was about 30 feet from the creek and along the bend of the mountain. We were both surprised by the dead muskrat because there was no sign of a predator nearby. I said that an eagle might have dropped it, but we haven't seen any eagles on our walk either. We walk another mile, and then we start putting our bait in the barrel. When they saw that the bait was already there, they knew that nothing had moved it. We were getting ready to leave. When we heard branches breaking, we looked in the direction of the noise and saw a big piece of tree rolling down the side of the mountain toward us. About 400 yards up on the ledge, something with 2 legs and the color of a moose was leaning against a tree stump. I nudged and asked my friend, "So what is it?" He answered, "Must be an elk," I told him, "but it only has 2 feet." He didn't say anything back, but he started walking back to the trail. I turned around and looked back at the animal. From what I could tell, it was at least 8 feet tall, very wide at the shoulders, and had long, skinny legs compared to the rest of its body. I couldn't tell what its head looked like because I couldn't see a neck, and it seemed to be looking down the mountain at us with its head bent. It quickly moved behind the broken tree and into the tree line. I wish I had my binoculars with me on that day. But because we were in a hurry to get to the trail that morning, I left them in the truck. As I walked back along the trail to the truck, I almost felt like I was being followed. A strange role reversal. My friend quickly moved down the path. When I told 2 friends about what happened a few months later, no one said a word about what was on that hillside. I had completely forgotten about the part about the dead muskrat, but my friend quickly reminded them of it, because it was a very upsetting thing for him. Still, he laughed when I said we might have seen a Bigfoot, which he took as a joke. Site is near a drainage that leads to a larger creek. A year ago, while hunting deer on a mountain pass, I heard some strange and disturbing sounds. In August 2017, my son and I were fishing in a quiet creek. In some places, the creek is very shallow, so you have to wait to get to it. We fished around a low-water bridge for about an hour before deciding to go upstream to the next deep hole just over some shoals. I knew that there were lily pads around the bend of the creek where the depot was, so I told my son to move slowly and quietly so we wouldn't scare away any bass that might be eating nearby. Once we went around the bend, I saw what looked like a beaver about 75 yards upstream where the water is deeper. It was heading towards some big rocks, but its shape seemed strange. It stood higher out of the water than any beaver or otter. I saw the animal get close to the rocks and stop just a few feet away from the group of rocks in the water. If I hadn't seen it move at first, it would have been easy to miss because it looked just like the rocks. I saw that my son was also watching it, so I asked him what it was. And I said I wasn't sure, so I made some noise with some cattle calls to try to scare it onto the rocks so we could see it better. But what came next still makes me feel a little scared. I'm just thinking of it. It started to swim back to the other side of the river, but stopped for a second. After that, it came up out of the water. Now I know that what I was looking at was huge because the water in that part of the creek goes up to my chest, and I clearly remember being able to see the sun between its legs. It stood there for maybe 3 seconds at most, but I will never forget what it looked like. Its fur was reddish, and its huge arms just hung at its sides, so close to the water that they almost touched it. The sun was right behind it, so I couldn't see any of its features. After what seemed to me to be a stare down, it swam toward the bank it came from, which was an erosion bank with a 10-foot tall wall, and used a tree with a 1-foot wide trunk to pull itself up. By doing this, it pulled the whole tree down to the water, roots, and all. We heard it run off into the thickets, where we could no longer hear it. We didn't wait long to get back to the truck with my son. Since then, I haven't been back to that place. I think it was at the creek doing whatever it was doing, and when we came along, it tried to look like a beaver to hide from us. I had always heard about these and thought it would be cool to see one. I'm sorry I saw it now. It scared and excited me at the same time, but who can tell? My son doesn't talk much about it, and I keep it all to myself. The father of my son and I came to the Buffalo National River area from Oklahoma. I chose a waterfall for us to find in my book about waterfalls. Hideout Hollow was our choice. When we got to the parking area at the trailhead, we turned off the car. Our windows were down because we were both smoking cigarettes at the time. I heard what it would sound like if you were in the bathroom and your dog was sniffing under the door. I whispered to him, "Did you hear that?" he said. What I heard was the sound of heavy machinery in the distance. I just felt thankful, so I let it go. He paid attention to the sound. We were about to start walking down the trail when I realized that we had left our walking sticks in the car. I ran back to get them. I felt a little creeped out, but I didn't worry too much about it because I could still see him. When I found him again, we started walking again. We were just about to turn left when we heard rustling in the trees to our left. We both stopped and looked. We saw a very tall person run through the trees. At first I thought it was a man, but then I saw that it was covered in chocolate brown hair all over. I remember seeing its arms in front of it, like it was pushing away branches to protect its face, and its black hands. "What was that?" I asked in a whisper. He replied in a whisper that he didn't know. I asked him if he wanted to go back. He quickly nodded his head. Yes, the way it was going, it would have crossed the trail right around the bend. We turned around and quickly walked back to the car, both of us keeping an eye on what was going on behind us. I started asking questions to make sure we were both looking at the same thing. Neither of us forgot that it was on its hind legs, brown, much bigger than us, and moving quickly. Suddenly, something flew quickly over our heads. It might have been a rock that hit some leaves and branches. I turned around and looked at my son's dad with a what the heck look on my face. His eyes were huge. The rest of the way to the car, we ran. I'd never been so scared before, and I wasn't sure we'd make it back to the car. We started to question what we had just seen right away. We thought it might have been a bear, a deer, an elk, etc. I asked him if he had ever seen a bear run like that on its back legs, or a dark deer or elk run that smoothly. He said no, but we went to the Tea Kettle Falls area, but I was too scared and anxious to get out of the car again, sure that whatever it was could have easily covered ground. Once we got service again, a Google search told us that only black bears live in Arkansas, but I'm sure what we saw was brown. I didn't notice any smells, but since we're talking about it, I also didn't notice if it was quiet or if any birds were chirping. I know I don't want to go back to the area though. I always feel sick to my stomach. I consider it. We started fishing along a slough a few weeks ago, and it's been a good place to catch fish. So we decided to clear out a spot along the river where we could camp. Strange things have been going on for about a week. Now, my friend Jacob and I were fishing at night along the bank when he saw something across the lake looking at us. I stopped the jeep and shone the headlights across the lake, and he saw what looked like amber eyes staring at us. He and Jonathan, our other friend, both said the thing was huge and could have easily been 8 or 9 feet tall. It was hunched over in a tall patch of dead grass. It also had brown fur with waves, but I never got a good look at it because it ran away. I would have been able to see it. Now, we all decided last Friday to go camping and forget about what happened that night. We set up late at night as clouds were rolling in and it started to rain, but we didn't care about the bad weather and even grilled burgers over our open fire pit. Eventually, Jonathan and I left Jacob alone so we could go cut more wood. Jacob said that after we left, my dog, which was a small dog, became very anxious and would bark and howl at the woods around us. Then Jacob started to whimper and drink wine. He told my friend that he felt like he was being watched, but he didn't want to ruin our camping trip. He also smelled something when the wind shifted for a moment. He says the smell was like a small, strong-smelling gym rat after a hard workout, but maybe 10 times stronger. We went back soon after, and Jacob was getting scared, so I took him home. Jonathan and I stayed until about 1 a.m. when the encounter happened, but we didn't see anything. Jonathan was cutting down a small tree for more firewood when he heard a loud whooping, moaning sound just 30 feet behind us. We had never heard that sound before from any animal. We spent a lot of time together hunting in the woods. Key and I were talking about the sound on the other side of the fire, closer to the water, when it came back, this time much louder, deeper and closer. As the hair on the back of our necks stood up, I told them it was time to leave. I got my dog out of the tent by pulling it. The dog is usually very active and happy, but on this night he was scared and wouldn't leave the tent. On one side of the jeep, he was very quiet and didn't move while sitting in the back seat. At this point, I was so scared that I jumped into the passenger seat instead of going to the driver's side, where the sound was coming from. We drove away and left all of our camping gear. Once we left the area, the bad feelings we had seemed to go away. When we came back the next day, our camp was still in good shape, but my tent, which had been closed at the time, was open. I looked for a sign, but the only thing I could see was that the burger patties were gone. We also had an old, half-burned hoe that we used to shovel up leaves. Tonight, it broke, but we moved it far away from the fire. It was burned up and found near the fire. Near the sand, we also found what looked like a footprint, but we can't be sure what it is. Even though I was a size 13, it was bigger than my face. At about 5 p.m., I was going to the store, so I was driving down Highway 258. We've had flooding in the past few weeks. So, I was driving slower than usual and keeping an eye out for deer. I saw 2 different groups of deer. I could see 3 on one, at least 6 years old. So, on my way back from the store, I knew to slow down in those spots, just in case. In one spot, the road made a sharp turn, and that was where I had seen the most deer. I slowed down as I got close to the curb, and then something jumped out in front of my car. I'll call it a he from now on. It looked like it was running from the pine tree line and jumped out onto the road. He left after that. Just 1 or 2 steps on the road were enough to clear the whole road. I slammed on the brakes and sat there in shock, not sure if I had really seen what I thought I had. I thought he or she was at least 8 feet tall, because he or she was standing on 2 legs and had a lot of fur. He was about a car length ahead of me when he jumped in front of the car. He looked like he was holding a big fish. I know that sounds strange, but I swear that fish was long. My husband thought it might have been a stick, but I grew up in the country, so I know my fish. His quote-unquote fore was longer than a bear's fore. He was dark brown, but his hair had a reddish tint to it. We could see the colour well as it jumped across the road because of the headlights. Back where he was running, there is a lake, but he also jumped over to the right, where 6 or more deer stood. At first light, we're going back to see if he left any footprints. It's so valuable that I hope to see some of it. Almost every night, we hear sounds out here that we call Bigfoot sounds, but I honestly never thought they were out here. It's just sounds that are hard to explain. So we call them Bigfoot sounds. Several of my friends and family have been here. They have heard it so many times that one of them won't stay outside for long. When I got home, my husband helped me bring things inside and asked what was wrong. I said that these deer are not good. He asked me if I hit one, and I told him I hadn't. He then asked me why I was shaking. I didn't know I was still shaking all over. When I started to tell him, I was crying. My heart was pounding, and I was still shaking. So bad. It really upset me a lot. I don't know what to say next. It was one of the most amazing and scary things I've ever seen. I can't sleep tonight because I can't stop thinking about it. Exactly what happened? I'm writing this because I think I might have seen or talked to a Bigfoot recently. I live in Springdale. Springdale, Arkansas, is not very rough in terms of force, but it can be pretty quiet in the right places. On October 10, 2000, a friend and I went on a trip to find out how far a creek goes. Because when I was young, I used to follow this creek. This creek flows through Springdale and into Elm Springs. On one side to the left, there are only thick trees, and on the other side, to the right, there are only private fields. Well, Elm Springs isn't a big city, and unless you own the property, you wouldn't know where I was unless you lived there. I decided it was time to try to get out of the creek and up on the bank around 5 p.m. We had been going in and out of the creek for about 2 hours when I decided we could cover more ground on land before the sunset. Now that I'm 59, I think the creek bed was about 7 feet high, so I had my friends lift my foot up while I got my knee high enough to pull myself up. Now, the original plan was to pull him up once he was on top, but now that I think about it, I see how stupid that was. I would have had to be very strong, because I probably couldn't have even touched his fingertips from that high up. But it didn't matter because what I saw when I stood up scared me to death. The best way to describe how I felt is to say that my heart dropped and I was very shocked. When I stood up, all I could see was a thick forest or woods. Something caught my attention about 75 to 100 yards away, just before I could get a good look at it. It was big and brown, that much I knew. Now, I'd never seen a bear in the wild before, so I got scared right away. I took a quick look down and thought that if I jumped, I would break every bone in my legs because the water was only about a foot deep. And what I would say is just about 2 seconds, and keep in mind that I haven't even been able to warn my friend about what I thought was a charging bear yet. I turned around and saw this thing, or whatever it was, moving very quickly. Then I realized this could not have been a bear. I saw it clearly for a split second. What I saw that day is something I'll never forget. I remember that its head was very long. I guess you could say it looked a little bit like an egg. I know it wasn't a human face because I couldn't see the eyes. They must have been dark. I didn't really notice a nose either, but it was hard to see anything but the head because there was so much hair. The most important thing I'll never forget is how tall and heavy this thing was. It had hairy legs and was so big that it must have been the biggest part of this thing. So wide. It had to be as wide as a refrigerator if the legs were the same size as mine. I'd have to say that each of my legs was half of 2 sets. The shoulders were huge. From shoulder to shoulder they might have been 3 feet or more. I also remember that it took very wide steps when it walked. It sort of walked with its front body hunched over a little bit. I don't know if this thing was as tall as a person with bad posture, but it seemed like it. Its head was high up in the trees. Don't get me wrong, the trees weren't that tall, but where the branches started to curl out, they were at least 8-9 feet tall. And I remember that the head was up there with them. The limbs were so high up that I couldn't have jumped up and touched them. So I made whatever I had seen 89 feet tall. Now that I think about it, the frame could have easily held 500-600 pounds. It looked like it had long arms that moved back and forth a lot. I don't remember any smell or anything like that, because this thing was out of my sight for about 567 seconds. When I was climbing up the creek bed, I realized I must have scared it because it didn't waste any time. It went into the woods right away, and I wasn't going to follow it. So, after all this, I asked my friend if he had heard anything. He said no, probably because he was down there, and the water was running, and I said, "Man, I just saw a monster go into the woods." Even though my face was very serious and solemn, he still didn't believe me. I told him this several times, and I think he knew by the look on my face that I was serious. He said that after he helped me, my face looked white and pale. I got back down into the creek, but it took a few minutes, and even then I fell back in. I wasn't hurt, but I was scared and wet. We ran and stomped our way back as the sun went down. We never tried to get back up on land. We talked about it and decided not to say such stupid things because we didn't want people to think we were crazy. In all honesty, I don't think he even believes me, but if I were him, I probably wouldn't either. But it's not important. What I saw, I know. So, to sum up, I have shown that a hoax is not possible. Why would someone be dressed like this, out in the middle of nowhere? How did they even know we would be there? And how do you explain the height and sides of the box? It was at least a foot taller than any person I'd ever seen. It was so tall, in fact. You can't even make something that tall. I hope someone reads this and takes it seriously, because after this I'm not sure if I'll ever go back into the woods again. I was standing outside my house in rural Washington County, Arkansas, near the border with Madison County at about 9 p.m. I was standing in my yard when I heard something coming from the woods to the north of my yard. Out of my 24 acres of land, 16 acres were heavily wooded. From the tree line, it sounded like a hooting howl with a deep throat. At the time, this noise happened about 3 times in a span of 15 seconds. My wife had just left the house about 2 weeks before, and I thought for a moment that the noise was coming from my grandfather, who lived next door. I yelled toward the line of trees. "Hey, that sounds like a good way to shoot an old man." There were 2 more times when the owl hooted. 2 coon hounds, a rat terrier, and a mix between a shepherd and a coonhound all ran off the porch and toward the tree line, barking and growling as if they saw something. I ran back to the house and grabbed my .22. I walked out the front door and turned west along the tree line. Along the tree line, I saw my dogs barking at something that was making the brush and tree limbs move. I followed this rustling line of brush along the wood line in the pasture behind my house for about 1,500 feet. As I walked, I noticed that my dogs were still barking, but they were still in the yard. I was by myself along the edge of the trees with my brush, swatting at bugs in the dark. I stopped and watched as the shaking of the tree limbs moved toward the west side of the property. During this run, I could also hear footsteps that sounded like someone was wearing heavy boots. When I got home and realized I might be in danger, I called my neighbor's grandparents right away. The phone was picked up by my grandmother. I just told her that was very funny, and she asked me what I was talking about. I told her that I thought my grandfather might be hiding in the woods to scare me. She just said, "Well, he's right here. He hasn't been out all night." Indeed. I talked to him, and he was 75 years old, so he didn't have time to get back home and slow down his breathing. In that range of time, I think that when I walked into the house, I woke up a Sasquatch who was looking around. Who really knows what it might have been?